So thanks for having me. So I'll be talking about some of the work that I started earlier in the year with Pat Manley and others towards developing a blueprint for resilience across the Tahoe and Central Sierra Initiative landscape. The goal is to help facilitate the increase in pace and scale of management through landscape planning. So with disturbances from drought and wildfire reaching unprecedented levels, there's been a strong focus on managing natural systems to increase their future resilience. And many forested landscapes are currently vulnerable to disturbance due in part to both legacy of forest management and fire suppression, as well as ongoing rapid climate change. And dry forests in the Western US are particularly vulnerable given that the role that fires play in shaping these ecosystems and how the effects of climate change are currently being realized as evidenced in recent record-setting wildfire seasons. So resilience is focused on the capacity for systems to absorb disturbances and self-organize into structural and functional states similar to the pre-disturbance conditions. And while that's useful in concept, it's really not at all straightforward in how you translate that into action and to realize the benefits of management. So natural systems, the only certainty, as they say, is uncertainty, and disturbances are an integral part of the Western US landscapes, meaning that large portions of the landscape are in constant recovery of one form or another from disturbances at all times. So ecosystem dynamics are driven by both top-down influences such as climate and bottom-up factors such as stand dynamics processes, microclimates, topographic relief. And so this creates a large amount of complexity on the landscape, such that small changes in, say, mean annual temperatures can result in huge impacts on the trajectories of these landscapes moving forward. And so, for instance, small fires can result in really large fire complexes in a matter of hours or days under the right conditions. And so management really needs to be flexible and utilize a range of proactive and reactive management strategies to sort of help plan for the future. So landscape planning approaches can help to identify, the key structures and processes and functions that are desired from the landscape, identify where they currently exist and where they have the potential to sustain themselves in the future. And so focusing management on individual stands without actually considering their value and vulnerability within the context of the broader landscape may have negative unanticipated consequences. So given the vastness and interconnectedness of the Western US landscape, landscape planning is most effective across really large landscapes. We're talking hundreds of thousands to millions of hectares. And then such scales that are relevant encompass large environmental gradients, hydrologic processes, wildlife corridors, wildfire dynamics, and also the rural communities that are most influenced by these landscape dynamics. And then therefore, landscape planning necessitates an all lands approach which involves coordination, involvement, and buy-in from stakeholders across all different groups. This also requires assessing both the current and future dynamics of the landscape to determine the current state and likely future outcomes of the key structures and processes that are focus of management. And this obviously, given that the future is unknown and largely we're relying on models to give us some indication about what the future holds, there's a lot of uncertainty that is associated with these plans. So by looking at cross ownerships, we're faced with not only managing ecological complexity, but also socio-ecological complexity. So how human communities are influenced and impacted by our management actions. So to address this, a conceptual model was developed over several years using workshops among scientists, stakeholders, and policymakers to inform how best to move forward with landscape planning. So this, call it the framework of resilience, incorporates 10 pillars that describe the desired outcomes from resilient landscapes that benefit both the ecology as well as the humans that depend on the ecology. Each of these pillars is defined by a set of elements that broadly characterize the key structures, processes, and functions that influence resilience. And then each element in turn is quantified by multiple metrics that actually quantify the landscape. So for instance, for the forest resilience pillar, we assess whether the vegetation structure and composition is sort of in line with its disturbance regime, climate, and topography. And the elements used to characterize forest resilience are things like forest structure, composition, and disturbance dynamics. And then within forest structure, the metrics that would quantify that are things like forest density, basal area, large tree abundance, heterogeneity, zero stage, all things like that. So we recognize that, you know, these pillars are not necessarily to be, you know, taken in isolation, but they're highly interdependent. And so when you pull the lever on one of the pillars, that is, if you use, you know, management to influence, you know, part of this web, the implications of management could be far-reaching. And this also suggests that certain areas may contribute more benefits than others, and you can actually manage for multiple benefits at once.
Nick, I'm just going to interrupt really quick. I think we can't see your slides, so if you were intending to share your slides, we're not seeing them. Thanks.
Okay. That was definitely the intent. And can you see them now?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay. Can you see the whole, can you make it a full screen?
Is that doing it? There it is.
Looks good.
So you guys are just looking at my old face the whole time, huh? That's great. Sorry. Okay, well, moving on. Sorry about that, everyone. So
you might just really quick, you might want to go back so folks can actually see the pillars really quick, since that's such, yeah, there we go. Just so folks can see them. Yeah. Okay.
Well, we can only go up from here. So, so here are the 10 pillars of resistance or of resilience. So yeah, so you have forest resilience, biodynamics, carbon sequestration, biodiversity, all the way down to social well-being, air quality, things like that. Anything else? So management can serve many roles on the landscape by nudging the system in one of a variety of ways. So there's resistance strategies that can be used to protect valuable infrastructure or other rare elements in the landscape. Packs, old growth forest, rare vulnerable community types. Adaptation strategies can set the forest up to better absorb future disturbances and maintain those characteristic structures and functions. And then transformation, both passive and active management, can help facilitate the transition to sort of alternative stable states if that's you know, where appropriate. So we've seen this map a few times. This is again the Tahoe Central Sierra Initiative landscape. It's 2.4 million hectares, right around Lake Tahoe and west. There's 3 national forests, nearly dozens of agencies and institutions involved in this. And so there are 3 broad objectives of this project. One is to assess the current conditions of the landscape, and that's being led by Kristen Wilson, who we just heard from today from the TNC, among many, many others. Second is to model the future conditions into the future. We just heard from Charles Maxwell, who's running the Landis II landscape simulation model, where we're looking at the future of the landscape under different climates and human growth population scenarios and several management scenarios. So the idea here that we're presenting is to incorporate these data and a lot more into a spatial decision support tool to inform landscape planning efforts. So really broad brush, decision support tools are, you know, software packages that are used to provide a quantitative, defensible, and transparent methodology for assisting strategic landscape management planning. It's an overall structure that you can use to identify, you know, overall management goals and objectives, not just in isolation, but across stakeholder groups, using scientific information. And you can help determine the key structures and processes that you're aiming management to help improve. This is where you for sure identify the spatial data needs, so collecting that huge data stack that we see on the right. Identifying the target conditions to evaluate the current condition of the landscape against. So these target conditions are super important in the decision support tool, because they're the things that are sort of judging how departed or how close to some kind of desired or target condition that is currently existing. And these targets come from the scientific literature. Groups of stakeholders can come together and sort of identify those values also, and where lacking all of that, it comes from expert opinion. And then the idea, another huge component of decision support tool, is engaging the key stakeholders that are sort of most influenced by these decisions. So specifically, we're using what's called the Ecosystem Management Decision Support Tool, which is composed of two models. The logic model, which is focused on the ecology of the system and asks the question, what is the state of the system? And I'm going to focus on this part of the model now, and then come back to the second model here, the decision model, which asks, given the state of the system, what can we do about it? The logic model itself is composed of a variety of logic networks that you can see on the right here. Here is just an example, which is looking at the main proposition of managing for forest resilience, but specifically looking here within the forest resilience pillar, that of the element for seral stage. So basically what this says is we're evaluating the composition of seral stages within watersheds across the TCSI landscape, and watersheds that have about 5 to 15% in early seral and 10 to 15% in late seral are considered sort of within the target range and have a low support for management. Anything above or below would suggest that management may play a role in increasing the resilience of the landscape. And these two propositions are yarded up using what's called a fuzzy logic operator. Here it's the union operator, which essentially takes the average of both of those scores and attributes it to the watershed. So here you can see that we are taking our concept of the blueprint for resilience and incorporating it into the EMDS decision support tool application for TCSI. Here we have all 10 of the pillars being yarded up using that union operator to assess the main topic of opportunities for management. So here we're going to focus, and it's important to note that all of these are being averaged together, and each of these have equal weights, and we'll kind of get into that in a few slides down the road here. So here we're going to focus on the fire dynamics pillar, which is a main topic within the decision support tool. Fire dynamics itself is composed of two elements: the element of functional fire, so that's like the prospect of using low and moderate severity fire to increase resilience, and then high severity fire. So if we click on the functional fire, we see functional fire here is our element, and down here we have our metrics that are using to quantify the landscape for this element. So basically, where currently you have low, so this is assessing both the current and the future states of the system. So currently, where you have low amounts of high severity fire, you would be considered within target and have a low priority for management. So if you have large amounts of high severity fire currently, and high severity and fire in general is a low proportion of the total amount of disturbance that a watershed is experiencing, you would have a high support for management here. So you could actually use management to reduce the current levels of high severity fire and incorporate fire into the watershed. Looking into the future, though, if you are finding that the watershed is continually being hammered by high severity fire and fires representing a large portion of the disturbances, you may not actually be able to affect change using management, so it would receive a low score for management. So these are yarded up and into the functional fire score. And then we can go back and then look at the high severity fire. And very quickly, where watershed, so this is looking at the patch scale, and you could look at the probability of high severity fire using modeling across the TCSI. And currently where there's high probability for high severity fire, and a cell is within a high probability of being within a large high severity patch, that would mean that there would be high support for management. But again, if you're constantly in the future seeing that you're getting bombarded by high severity fire, perhaps you're just in a high severity fire regime, and management would have less of a role here. So quickly, these logic networks are used to map logic scores across the TCSI landscape to sort of identify areas where there's high levels of support for management. This is repeated across all the pillars, and you can look at individual pillars or combinations of pillars to look at ultimate support or not support for management. As I mentioned, there's two models within the EMDS, the logic model, which we just talked about, and then the decision model, where you can use stakeholder input to put more weight or less weight on individual pillars depending on preferences by the stakeholder groups. And these can be evaluated using things like online surveys or workshops where collaborators can come together and sort of develop a consensus for this weighting. The weights are then put into the model, and the map of priorities are then adjusted based on these weightings. And to be sure, these maps that you're seeing are for illustration purposes and are not actual results yet. So in summary, everyone be sure to share your screen before you start presenting. So as we talked about, recent efforts have been moved forward to increase the pace and scale of restoration to increase the future resilience to disturbances. But given the complexities of these social ecological systems, it's not necessarily clear how to translate these concepts of resilience into actual management. So in an attempt, we're using these 10 pillars of resilience to sort of formalize the benefits that can be attributed to the landscape. And using a DST, we can map management opportunities based on both the current and future conditions compared to the set of target conditions. And that stakeholders can have direct access to the model, both in setting these targets and also weighting each of the pillars based on consensus priorities. So the logic model networks are continuing to be built, and sort of on a side, we're also researching ways to incorporate our DST outputs into optimization software called Forces to help develop a 10-year plan towards achieving multiple benefits over that time horizon. So thank you very much.